we'll get everyone situated and the webinar started. Thank you everyone for attending. This is our final scale insect webinar for the spring season. So welcome and thank you for attending. And for those of you that have attended our prior webinars, thank you so much. It's been a joy to have you here. We're very excited. Today, we are going to be going over scale management and really the applications out in the field of how to apply and make management plans that are effective and useful for you and your clients. My name is Chris Haugen. I'm with Rainbow Scientific Advancements. I am a national account salesperson. I've been with Rainbow for about 12 years in various roles in the field and on the sales side for Rainbow Scientific. And I'm really excited to have Patrick Anderson join me from way down in North Carolina at his home arboretum. He is our head of arboriologist, and he is our head technical manager. And really, Patrick is just a wealth of knowledge, as you'll find out and see here, for plant healthcare and tree healthcare as well. So welcome, Patrick, and we're excited to have you. And kind of as you'll see today, I'll be going over some slides about these applications and kind of some of the key distinctions of what each one is and what each of the distinctions means for you in practice of how to manage scale insects. And then Patrick is going to be out in the field demonstrating the actual applications and going over some of the finer details of how to do these and what you should be looking for to successfully manage them. But before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping here. Please type your questions into the question and answer box using your control panel, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. And please avoid using the chat feature. Please use the question and answer. That way we can make sure that as we're going through each question, we can check off to make sure that we did actually see it and that we did answer it. Otherwise, if it's in the chat, unfortunately, if there's many chats that are going, we may miss one, and we would not want to miss a question that you have. And then this webinar is worth 1 ISA CU. If you didn't enter your ISA certification number during registration, please type that into the question and answer. I have Matt Karst, who's joined us today. He is going to be here to support us on the back end here. If there's anything we miss, we'll make sure that he'll be here to make sure that we get that answered and we get you taken care of. And it is 1 credit is available each for Hawaii, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina state pesticide credits. We'll submit a link to a form where you enter your information at the end. And then also in the Q&A and the chat feature, we'll also be putting in any information, any links that we are recommending. Like we have a really wonderful scale, PHC scale guide, and also a spring plant healthcare guide that we'll provide you the link to in the chat so that you can download that and then do some reading at the end. So with that, we'll get started. So what are we here today to talk about? Today, we're here to provide you with the knowledge needed to build a successful scale management program. Scale insects are probably one of the more challenging pests that we deal with out in the landscape. And we're going to go through some basic life cycles. And really, this is building on some of those prior webinars, which if you didn't have a chance to check them out, please do log on to treecarescience.com and you can look at any of them. And this is really kind of the final step of, so you've built a program for your scale insect on your property. Let's go through today those finer points of how do I actually do some of these applications so that I can get the results that I'm looking for my clients. And then know how to apply each tool properly to achieve your goals. So those are kind of the 2 higher level outcomes that we're going to go through today. And I'll kind of go through some slides and then Patrick will take over from there. So the first thing is, what is a scale? And really at a high level, they're in the order of Hemiptera. So they're the same as aphids, adelgids, and whiteflies. They're in that same order. And really what distinguishes them or kind of links them together is how they feed. It's that piercing sucking mouth part. They're actually inserting that little stylet into the plant or into the cell and then pulling out some of the interstitial fluid. And then what really makes them unique is that they're highly modified. You'll notice there's all different physiologies of scale insects. Some are cottony, some are armored, some look like kind of like a clam shell. But what really brings them all together is the adult females usually lack wings, legs, or segmentation. And then there's 5 scale families, but primarily there's 2 that we deal with. Now there is a third that's a little, it's uncommon, but we still see it in the landscape. But typically we just kind of drop them into 2 different categories. There's soft scale or armored scale. And the easiest way to distinguish these, honestly, is there honeydew or is there not? And we'll go through kind of those and what relevant land or management applications those both have. What's their impact on plants? Really, it's aesthetic appeal for most of the time. They can make the plant look pretty terrible. They'll make the leaves either stifled, they'll cause branch decline, or the leaves can look very chlorotic, or the scale insects themselves can make the plant look disfigured. And then from the honeydew is a misnomer in that it's not the waste, it's the interstitial fluid from the plant that the insect or the scale isn't able to actually process to utilize. So it's just kind of their pass-through for it. But that honeydew is a it's a very sugary substance, and it's a perfect growing medium for sodium mold, which is a plant fungal pathogen. It will decrease the photosynthetic activity, so making the plant a little less vigorous. And then certainly it can cause economic losses if you have a decrease in the plant quantity because they're dying, and also the quality. The plant just doesn't look as healthy. And just as a quick kind of diagnostic thing, if you're looking at a whole leaf that's impacted, typically that is a soft scale that you're more likely to be dealing with because they are actually feeding on the xylem tissue of that plant. Whereas if it's a single cell, kind of up here in the top part here in this top right photo, that is more likely an armored cell because that scale is actually piercing the individual cell and sucking out the fluid of that individual cell. The cell dies, it moves on to the next cell. So it's kind of giving that stifled appearance. If we're looking at a generalized life cycle for scale insects, they all are going to follow kind of a similar pattern here. The eggs, where they begin, are laid under the shell of a female. And then in the early season, typically we're looking at probably, maybe late March or early April, depending on where you are in the country. Obviously, the more southern parts of the country, you're going to have this occurring earlier in the season. Maybe it might even be January, February if you're in the southern parts of Florida or Texas. But the first instar crawlers, so this stage is mobile, and they'll move to their new feeding location. And then once they settle, which takes just a couple of days after they're hatching, the crawlers will molt for the first time. And then after they molt, they'll go to second instar, where the crawlers have settled. In this stage, what's important is they don't have legs or antennae. They're really just stuck where they are. And then as they move to the third instar, they have their protective coatings. And this is more important because it might be more difficult to get insecticide control on them. They're protected with that outer shell. And then as they move to adults, the sedentary females may be fertilized by the winged males. The males are able to move around whereas the females can't. And the fertilized females remain on the plant through the dormant season. And that's where you kind of, where some of your dormant oils become important because they can reduce that subsequent generation because the females are suffocated by that dormant oil. Now this is a generalized life cycle. It's not the same for everyone. And certainly if you're looking at armored scale, they may do this a few times per growing season. And as we talked about with soft scales, they're going to overwinter as second instars on twigs. And then the early spring, the female scales are going to mature and lay their eggs. And then your crawlers are going to probably emerge in late May or June. Now, some scale insects like magnolia scale, those crawlers may not emerge until later in the growing season, like August. But from just an identification standpoint, they're typically larger, about 1/4 of an inch, and they're smooth or cottony in appearance, and they're typically round. And they're feeding on the phloem sap. but they do excrete honeydew. And then you'll notice that you'll have about hundreds to thousands of eggs, depending on species, and most have only one generation per year. You might have 2 generations for some scales in the southern climates, as they're just able to complete that life cycle. But most are going to overwinter as nymphs. Counter that to armored scales. Typically, armored scales are much smaller. You can see kind of here on this photo here how small they are versus the large armored scales like Lacanium scale. And the females are going to overwinter in their 3rd instar. And then the matures will lay about 100 eggs in the spring, and this can depend upon the scale as well. And then the 1st generation crawlers will emerge typically much earlier in the growing season. And then they're going to be active for about 4 to 5 weeks when you'll then have your 2nd generation. And it's going to vary depending on which scale you're looking at. But most life stages, they're not mobile, so they aren't moving as much. And you'll also notice they don't lay as many eggs typically per female. But because they often can do multiple generations, that's where you can have some of these armored scale populations really expand and become out of control quite quickly. Now, recognizing that it's tough to kind of narrow down all these species and what you're trying to deal with here, we recognize that it's important to have access to this technical material quickly. So we have specialized protocols for multiple regions and multiple scale insects. You'll reach out to your territory manager. They can help build you a management plan for the scales that you're dealing with. We have over 50 available across the country for both armored and soft scales. So just reach out to Rainbow. We'll take care of you. We want to make sure you have the tools that you need in order to manage these scales. And we have certainly support with our identification. We have our tech support, online, our live chat, and then certainly if you're looking at some great resources just to kind of provide you photos or life cycles, or if you need to provide it to maybe a homeowner, University of Maryland, Purdue, Ohio State, I should say the Ohio State, and the University of California IPM guides, they are fantastic resources for you to find some of that information about life cycles and kind of key diagnostic features as well. In Rainbow, we are an advocate of the toolbox approach, especially for scale insects. With the multiple life cycle stages and also the multiple generations, and just also you have different needs from clients. Having as many tools in your toolbox is important. So we'll go through each of these, but we're going to kind of walk you through a year in the life of scale management. So we're going to start in the dormant stages in maybe early spring prior to the development of the plant, where we're going to start with our dormant oils, with our TSA horticultural oil, and then we'll move through the calendar from spring to summer and then back into fall of what you might be looking at for a scale insect. So keep that in mind as we go through each of these, and we'll get into a little more depth with each tool on each program. The first thing to note is with soft scale management versus armored scale. You'll notice on soft scale management that we have a few more options. We've got Zytect, which is our imidacloprid product. Zytect is a systemic neonicotinoid. Now the key point, and which is unfortunately more common, is that we think people will think that Zytect will work on all scales. It's unfortunately not the case. Zytect is not effective on armored scales. It just does not translocate as effectively into those adjacent cells to give you mortality on scale insects. So Zytect can only be used with soft scale. This can certainly be helpful for Lacanium scale or really large trees where maybe you have to do a trunk injection. But just keep that in mind. And then when we're looking at armored scale, obviously our toolbox is a little bit more limited. We have our insect growth regulator in peroxide for doing our crawler stage sprays. And then we have our dinotectron products, which are Transtect and Transtect infusible. These are extremely effective systemic tools for managing armored scales and also soft scales. It's definitely utilize both. The important part to note here is that Transtect can be bark applied, it can be soil applied, and it can also be foliar applied or with Transtect infusible injected as well. This is going to give you very high levels of insect control, and it's going to move into those lateral cells because it's so water soluble. It's going to give you very high levels of insect control for a very predictable amount of time. So let's start the season off with dormant oil. It can be used on all plant material. It's going to require complete coverage of the entire plant. And as you'll see from Patrick here, when he talks about kind of where you want to apply it and how you want to mix it, this is not a systemic tool. It is literally just coating the plant and the scale that you're targeting to suffocate that plant. Or pardon me, not suffocate the plant, to suffocate the scale. So this is it's a broad spectrum tool, but it's quite environmentally friendly. But it's designed to reduce that population, as I mentioned, with those overwintering females with their eggs. This is going to suffocate them. So I'll kick it over to Patrick here. He's going to go over horticultural oil.
Thanks. So for many of us, a horticultural oil treatment could either be the beginning or the end of our scale toolbox approach to managing scales. And the reason for that is most of the time we're applying horticultural oils in the quote dormant season. So that is after the leaves have fallen off the target plant or before the leaves have come back on the target plant. So in this case here, this magnolia is pretty typical of when we'd be applying a horticultural oil. Here we're in early spring, so you can see the leaves have not come back out yet. And here we're targeting a magnolia. So this magnolia may have either magnolia scale or tulip tree scale overwintering on it. So our first key distinction about using these dormant oil sprays would be we want to make sure that scale species is overwintering on as a nymph. So we're going to be more effective as scale species that overwinter as a nymph. So again, those would be our tulip tree scales, our magnolia scales. Lecanium scale is another popular scale insect that overwinters as a nymph. And when we spray, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be spraying to drip because we want to make sure that we're coating these branches because we need to coat that nymph. If we don't coat that nymph, then we're not going to be effective in our treatment here. We're going to be using higher rates of horticultural oil, so anywhere from 2 to 3 gallons per 100 gallons. And another important to note is that we want to avoid freezing temperatures. So we want to apply when temperatures are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and we want to apply within a 24-hour period of a freezing event. Those are going to be best management practices to avoid any burn that you might see. Again, on a dormant plant with no leaves, low chance of phytotoxicity, but we want to be safe. In a moment here, I'm going to spray this. And you'll see when I spray, again, just to reiterate, I need to coat these branches. If we don't coat the branches, if we don't get full and even coverage, we're not going to get adequate contact to that insect, and we're not going to have, again, good control when we report back in the spring to see how we did. So let's get ready to do a spray. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm going to spray up into the plant. I'm going to keep my feet planted so I don't trip and spray anything accidentally. I'm going to use as low volume as possible to get the coverage I want and get a nice coarse spray on these plants. And I'm spraying to drip to make sure I'm getting really good coverage. What I'm going to do now is I got this side really well. I'm going to come across to the other side. And now I'm going to get it from this side to ensure good coverage, making sure I'm coating the plant, coating any overwintering nymphs. All right, and so what we want to point out here is how these twigs are glistening with the horticultural oil treatment. So we got good coverage, and if we had those nymphs overwintering on this plant that we just treated, we would see that we would have coated those nymphs, which would disrupt their respiration. As the product dried, it would pull moisture out of them and dry them out a little bit as well. And so we would be comfortable in our coverage here and what our treatment efficacy would have been here in this treatment. Back to you.
That was fantastic, Patrick. Thank you so much for showing us all those neat tips and tricks on how to do dormant oil. We'll switch over now as we progress into spring with our systemic control methods. As I mentioned, there's two kind of buckets that we have here. Zytec, which is only effective on soft scales. So think of Lecanium scale or tulip tree. It's applied early in the spring, and this is going to be typically done as a soil injection or soil drench. But keep in mind, if you have maybe plants where you have mites or mite concerns, it is possible that you could have a mite flare up. So it is, you know, if you want to have that season-long control, just be aware of that you may have a mite flare up. Or if you want to not even have to worry about having a potential mite flare up, maybe consider looking at Transtect. Transtect is a dinotachyron-based product, and focus your soil applications 14 to 30 days prior to your expected scaling activity. And what's really nice is it is also effective on both soft and armored scales. So it can give you very predictable control with both species, and 90 days is probably what you're looking at for a length of control, and you don't have to worry about a mite flare-up. And there's a couple of ways we can do these applications. You can do a soil injection with an HTI, and Patrick's going to go through the finer points of that. So I'll kick it over to you, Patrick, to do that.
All right, so now let's talk about doing a soil injection. We'll do the soil injection, all the same principles apply to when we do a soil drench. That is, we want to make sure that our injection points are close in to the base of the tree. Now here, of course, we're going to be using an injection probe, so we want to take care that we're not jamming structural roots or damaging the root flare or the bark of the tree. As far as the application is concerned, there's a couple different ways we can do a soil injection. So many people have large spray equipment and traditional fertilizer probes, and these work really well to do a soil injection. Generally speaking, when we talk about using that type of equipment, we want to apply 1 quart of solution per inch diameter. And the reason for that is, on these larger pieces of equipment and with our traditional fertilizer probes, we can easily calibrate 1 quart as kind of our smallest amount of solution to put out around the tree. Again, when we do this, we want to stay close to the tree, following the root flares. And the reason for that is we are affecting more fine roots the closer we are to the tree, and likewise, the product has less room to travel or less area to travel when it's close into the tree. So we could do using our larger spray equipment and traditional probe very well, and that's been done for a long time. We could also use something like this. So this piece of equipment has a canister in it that can only hold 250 milliliters. So it's calibrated to 250 milliliters. So when I attach it to a small power backpack like I have on my back right now, or I can even attach this to a larger piece of spray equipment, I don't have to worry about calibrating my equipment because this is already pre-calibrated for me. So this makes it very easy to just go ahead and start doing injections and having really high dose confidence that I'm getting the active ingredient I need around the base of the tree. So again, same thing goes. I would measure the diameter breast height. That would then let me know how much product I need to mix in water. With what I have here, I'm going to be mixing 250 milliliters of solution per inch diameter. This is a 22-inch tree. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the tree injecting. I'm going to do 22 injection sites with even distribution around the base of the tree. So here we go. That's what we're going to do now. So I'll turn my pressure on, turn on my throttle, and here we go. And so our application is made. 22 injection sites, staying as close to the tree as possible. Some things you may have noticed is as I was making my second trip around, I started moving out a little bit from the tree. Depending upon your soil, you might start oversaturating the soil, and if you oversaturate the soil, then then you might have product come back out at you. So you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping mindful of that, but still staying in as close to the tree as possible.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. And I just wanted to reiterate here with our soil applications, kind of what the timing looks like. With Zytec, it does take a lot longer to get in the soil, as Patrick had mentioned. So about 30 minimum days to up to 120 days prior to crawler emergence. Transtect, anywhere from 14 to 30 days or 2 to 4 weeks prior to crawler emergence. If you are going to be, as we're talking about lower systemic bark spray, which we'll get to next, that is going to be a very easy application to do mid-season. And I didn't mention this prior, but Lepitect is also kind of your rescue treatment if you need to have one. It is a soil injection, 1 to 2 weeks prior to crawler emergence, but it does only last 30 days in the plant. So it is very short. So it is not going to give you season-long control. So we're going to go here shortly to basal bark sprays. And really the things to look for with Patrick is he's talking about the rates that you mix with Transtect WSP at, and then where you're applying it. So I'll kick it over to Patrick. Patrick, if you want to go through basal bark sprays, thank you.
So doing a lower systemic bark spray is a relatively new method, and it's a method that's beginning to catch on. So generally speaking, we have a few products that work very well as a lower systemic bark spray. One of the most common ones that we use is dinotefuran. So as we know, dinotefuran affects a whole host range of piercing and sucking insects. We also know dinotefuran as a systemic moves very quickly in the tree. And that would hold true for lower systemic bark sprays as well as soil applications. So with dinotefuran as a lower systemic bark spray, we know that it is moving up into the tree fairly quickly. So between 7 and 14 days, we should have concentrations build up into the canopy to where we're beginning to affect pests. So with lower systemic bark spray, we can do this very fast. And again, very low labor and easy equipment. So doing a lower systemic bark spray, we're just using a standard pump up backpack sprayer. And what we're doing is we're spraying the base of the tree from about 5 feet on the trunk down to the root flare, covering the entire circumference. What we want to do with dinotefuran is we want to apply 1.5 to 2 ounces per inch diameter to, again, the lower portion of the trunk, 5 feet down, coating the root flares, getting the full circumference. Easy enough to do. There are a few tips and tricks, though, to doing this so that you get enough active ingredient into the plant while not wasting it. There's also some things we need to think about from a label perspective that will help us out. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are getting enough active ingredient onto the tree. We also don't want to overdo it. Again, if we overdo it, we could be maybe affecting our pounds per square acre limit on our property. We could also have some unintended consequences with getting too much product into the tree. Likewise, we don't want to underdo it. So what we want to do is we want to calibrate our equipment so that we know we're getting at least 1.5 to 2 ounces of solution per inch diameter onto this tree. So the first kind of tip to trick to calibration is installing one of these control flow valves onto your pump up backpack sprayer. And so your label is going to talk about applying this application at a low PSI. And so what this here is, this is a 14 PSI control flow valve. What control flow valves do is they make it so that you can't spray at any higher PSI than 14 PSI, in this case with this control flow valve. So you can see on this particular piece of equipment, I have a nice little pressure gauge. So right now you can see I'm pressurized to about 30 PSI. When I squeeze the trigger here, this can only come out at 14 PSI. This is a 14 PSI control flow valve. So that way I know consistently how much is coming out of the tip because it can only spray out at 14 PSI. Now, likewise, the nice thing about this is that once it drops below 14 PSI, this is again a 14 PSI control flow valve, it will stop spraying altogether. So that way I know exactly how much is coming out of the hose. I know exactly what pressure is coming out of the hose. I don't have to worry about overpressuring or underpressurizing the system. So that is key to install your control flow valve so you can control the pressure coming out. The next part is we need to calibrate the time it takes for our solution to come out. So again, because we want to apply between 1.5 to 2 ounces of solution per inch diameter, we need to know what that actually means coming out of the hose. So if I have my control flow valve, I know the pressure that it's coming out at. The next thing would be to do a count. So to count how long it takes me to get to, a predetermined amount. So what I'm calibrating here for is I want to get at least 2 ounces of solution per a certain count. So we can do this a couple different ways. We can do it the old-fashioned way where we simply just count. So let's say we start with 1, 2, 3. And I can look, see where I'm at with 1, 2, 3. And at 1, 2, 3, I'm right at 2 ounces. So if I count 1, 2, 3, I'm going to get the solution out on the tree per inch that I want. Now, of course, the issue with doing that count method is that 1, 2, 3 can change throughout the day, right? A neat little trick that I learned from a colleague of mine was to use a metronome app that you can download onto your phone. So this by no means is a endorsement of this particular app here, but I use an app called Sound Corset that you can find again on your Google Play or your App Store, whatever it is. And with this app, it has a metronome function, and all I did was I determined what beat constituted 2 ounces. So in this case here, I can hit it. You can hear every beat is going to be 2 ounces. So instead of having to worry about counting 1, 2, 3, I just count beats. So with this tree, like many other of our applications, what we're doing here, our systemic applications, is that the diameter of the tree, of course, is going to dictate how much product we need to use, and then the solution that we're going to need. So again, this is a 22-inch tree. I would then cross-reference my label to see how much I need to mix for 22 inches. And again, we're going to mix it in a solution that we're applying about, again, 2 ounces to 1.5 ounces of solution per diameter, getting that full coverage around the bark. And now doing this is kind of, there's a little bit of an art to doing lower bark sprays. So I would encourage you, before you go out and start doing these, to kind of practice a little bit. Practice getting that full coverage around the base of the tree. So you probably want to start with some water. So calibrate your equipment. You want to, use some water and practice getting full coverage around the base of the tree there. And so I'm just going to move this out of our way. So again, I've done the calibration using my app. So I know that every beat is 2 ounces of solution. This is a 22-ounce tree, or excuse me, a 22-inch tree. So we'll use 22 ounces, or excuse me, 44 ounces, right? Something else to consider is the use of a bark penetrant. So using a bark penetrant can only help your solution. A lot of data shows that you may or may not need to use bark penetrants, but we still recommend using bark penetrants because it's only going to improve your solution, only help it to get through the lenticels in the bark up into the tree. Now, one important note is that if you're going to use a bark penetrant at the labeled rates, the label on those bark penetrants are going to say that you need to wear some kind of face protection like a face shield. And so you're going to want, if you use a bark penetrant, you're going to have to make sure that you have a face shield down as per the label. Another little tip that for doing this application is a lot of these backpack sprayers come with a pre-installed hollow fan or hollow cone spray nozzle, which is just fine. But what I like to do for these lower bark spray applications is I actually like to install a flat fan nozzle. And again, a flat fan kind of sprays in that one dimension, and that allows us to kind of get a directed flow right at the tree so we don't have a lot of drift going on and off, and also we don't have to kind of adjust our fan, because if we adjust our fan, we're going to mess up our calibration. So use a flat fan nozzle because it makes it easier to get it on the bark of the tree. Also doesn't mess up our calibration. If you're going to be using a bark penetrant, which we do recommend, though it's not required for all applications, you'll need to wear a face shield. So I'm going to just go ahead and treat this tree. Again, we have a 22-inch tree. So I'll be applying 44 ounces of total solution. That's going to be, again, 2 ounces per inch diameter. I'm going to spray from 5 feet down, coating the roof layer, getting the full circumference. And so you probably can't hear my metronome any longer, but I have my metronome set up here so I can hear it going. And so here we go. So I apply our solution. I was listening to my metronome. It counted 22 beats for me, so I knew I put out what I needed to put out. And notice what I did here is I kind of took this in 3 different levels. I started here at the top. I did a lap around. I moved down a little bit to a lower level. I did a lap around, and then finally in my last lap I made sure that I got down there on those roof layers. So again, it takes a little bit of practice. If you're going to do this method, encourage to practice with water first. Again, get your calibration, use your control flow valve, and highly recommend using a metronome app. That way you can just count beats instead of having to count in your head. Makes it very easy, very effective, and very fast. So personally speaking, we've been out on properties, we've treated over 40 trees in an hour using this method. Have a good one.
And lastly, we do want to touch on, for our systemic activities, we do want to touch on Transtect Infusible. It is a 22.5% formulation. And what's really fantastic about this is the low rates that you're actually applying it at. You're looking at anywhere from 1 to 4 milliliters per diameter inch. So it's a very quick application. You could use our Q gun or any of our micro injection devices to do this application. And it is going to be absolutely knockout awesome on scale insects.
So let's talk about trunk injection. So trunk injection is a great method, a great tool in the toolbox to apply products directly into the tree to affect our pests. So the question always comes up of, why do trunk injection when we have such great application methods for piercing and sucking insects like soil applications or lower systemic bark sprays? And that is a great question, and there's some good reasons for it. So one good reason for a trunk injection is that when we direct a product directly into the tree, there's no question of where it's going and how it's getting there. The other reason, of course, might be speed and distribution. So we see that with trunk injected products, the speed of uptake is much faster. So, thinking of things like imidacloprid. With imidacloprid, when we apply that as a soil application, it can take 30 to 120 days for it to get up into the canopy of the tree to be effective. Whereas when we do a trunk injection, it is much faster. We're talking about weeks instead of months. So that's another advantage, is speed up there. And then also, again, distribution-wise, because as long as we're getting even distribution of our injection sites along the base of the tree, we don't have to worry about movement in the soil. So those are some good reasons for doing trunk injections. Some other reasons would be to conserve just beneficial and benign insects. Because again, we're putting the product right into the tree. It's not going into the environment at all, right into the tree. We have less chance of introducing that product to some of our, our good insects, or our insects that really aren't hurting anything at all. A best management practice is going to be not to apply systemics around flowering plants or plants that attract pollinators. So in this case of this tree here, we can see we have some flowering plants right here, So this here is a type of flowering clover, an ornamental clover. Over here behind me, we also have, bear with me, we have some Lenten rose, which of course can flower. And so these are in very close proximity to the base of this tree, as you can see. So if we did a soil application, there's a chance that, we might, some of that application, some of that product might make its way into these flowering plants, and then it could affect our pollinators. So the method here, again, is we're going to measure the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet from the ground. And then, of course, that will dictate our dose. So I mentioned with diatefluran, in some cases, we're treating as low as 1 milliliter per inch diameter. So, if we had, in the case of, a 10-inch tree, we'd only be applying 10 mils to the base of that tree, or to the root flares of that tree. The next part of that then also talks about how many injection sites we want to do. And so we found that what we want to do with these systemic products that we mentioned, we want to do an injection site for every other inch of diameter. So if we're dealing with a 10-inch diameter tree, which of course this tree here is larger than that, but if we're doing a 10-inch diameter tree, we would do 5 injection sites around the base of the tree. And really what we mean when we say trunk injection, we mean concentration on the root flares. So you want to get down as low on that root flare as possible. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a low volume piece of plugless equipment in this case. So in this case here, we're using a piece of equipment where all you're using is hand power to squeeze it in. So, and that's the nice thing about doing things like dinoteffuran and imidacloprid, is that you get, you can use very low volume, so you don't need expensive or complicated equipment. You can use this low volume, easy to use equipment to do your application. And again, we're just doing concentrate. So what I would do is I'd put the concentrate into my bottle. Here I have my nifty bag and bottle here. So I just put the concentrate there into my bottle. I'd be set to go for the day. I'd pour that whole thing in there. And then I would make sure that I am calibrated, so I can adjust my calibration on this particular gun. I'd make sure I'm calibrated, so I'm only putting in the desired amount. And so let's say I'm doing dinoteffuran here. And so as I mentioned, we would be doing something as little as 1 milliliter per inch of diameter in this case. So if we were doing 1 milliliter per inch of diameter, and we're doing an injection site for every other inch of diameter. So again, if we had a 10-inch tree, we would be doing 5 injection sites evenly distributed along the root flares. So we would avoid any of these indentations. We'd avoid any of these sinuses. We would just get even distribution with concentration on the root flare. So again, if we had a 10-inch tree, we would be doing 5 injection sites. And so if we were doing 1 milliliter per inch diameter, that would be 2 milliliters per injection site. So I want to make sure that my equipment, whatever it may be, is calibrated so that I'm just doing 2 milliliters per injection site. So again, things to consider here is we want to use a 18-volt drill at least. We want to make sure we have a nice powerful drill, so again, we're not getting our bit bogged down. We want to make sure that our drill bit is sharp. As soon as we suspect that our drill bit is dulling out, we just want to change it. We don't want to keep one of these bits around. We want to make sure they're sharp. And you know they're sharp because as you're drilling, they're going to pull out big pigtails of wood. We call them pigtails. Once it starts to dull out, we're not going to see those pigtails anymore. And so we'll start seeing more of a finer dust. And that's when we know it's time to change out our bit. So again, if I'm looking at here, looking at even distribution on the root flares, I'm going to clear out my root flare here. I'm going to do my drilling so that I am perpendicular to the vascular system, because I want to cut right into that vascular system. I'm going to do a quick in and out motion. I don't want to linger in that hole. So I'll start, I'll get lined up, quick in, quick out. And so I'm only doing, for this specific piece of equipment, I'm only drilling 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch past the bark into the vascular system. And so that's exactly what I want to do, a nice little clean hole here. And now I'm simply going to install my tee. And again, with this piece of equipment, there's no need to have a hammer or chisel or anything. There's no need to have to pound this in. We're simply going to apply the tea. We're going to give ourselves a little right-hand turn. We're going to feel it kind of bite inside the wood. And then I'm simply just going to put in 2 milliliters of product. So we're going to do 1, 2, just like that, into the tree. I'm going to remove my tea. My application is done. So I would do this again. This was a 10-inch tree. I would do that 5 more times. Very fast, very effective.
So now that we've gone through our systemic applications, let's move on to our final part of the season, looking at crawler stage sprays. I'm going to let Patrick kind of go through how to do these, what you're looking for, and also what you're looking for to identify that crawler stage. So Patrick, take it away.
So now let's talk about application of one of my favorite products, and that is insect growth regulators. So and specifically here, what we'll be spraying is the active ingredient pyriproxyfen. So what this active ingredient does, it works as a juvenile hormone mimic, which means if you treat immature insects, they are not able to mature. Likewise, if you treat female insects, they lay inviable eggs, or those eggs that they lay, the insects inside will be deformed. And likewise, if the product comes in contact with the actual eggs themselves, again, those maturing young insects inside those eggs will likely be will hatch deformed. And so what's neat about this is you're not actually killing anything. Nothing dies on the day of application. You're just keeping it from maturing or moving on to the next life phase. So this is considered a softer product, a reduced risk product. And when we talk about making foliar applications, there's no restrictions around treating flowering plants. So that's one of the beauties of using insect growth regulators. I said, one of my favorite products to use. And now specifically, they work extremely well on scale insects, both armored and soft scale insects. Things to note though, of course, is that they're going to work better on the immature, specifically the crawlers. So you want to identify the species of scale and know when those crawlers are active. In the case of what we're doing today here is we have a camellia tree, a very common ornamental plant. This one here has a very common pest, T-scale on it. And so this is early spring, and you can see this is just an example of the underside of that leaf. You can see all that T-scale. And if we were to look at this under a microscope, you would see we would have active crawlers today, which means this is a perfect time to make applications. So the other nice thing about using pyriproxyfen is that it is translaminar. That means if we spray the top of the leaf, it'll get absorbed into the plant, and then any insects feeding on it will then come in contact with their feeding, and then they will, again, they'll interrupt their ability to mature. So a really interesting product, a really neat product, a product, again, that we can consider reduced risk, a way to preserve some of our other natural predators, and again, some of these benign insects out there in the landscape. Of note, you know, on the label, it's going to say that we need to wear some kind of head protection to keep the spray off our heads. I like to wear, of course, my hard hat with, this is not vented, so there's no vents in there. And I always like to wear a face shield anytime I'm spraying above. So with this, all we need to do is, we don't need to spray to drip, we just need to spray to wet. So we just need to get complete coverage. You know, we'll try to get the underside of those leaves, but the beauty is, of course, with pyriproxyfen, is if we don't get the underside of the leaf, we just get the top of the leaf, it'll get absorbed in there, they'll come in contact with it. And it has a 28-day residual, which is also nice. So for some of these crawler generations, for some of our scale species, we are again going to be very effective because it will be persistent on inside the leaves, gets absorbed inside the leaf. So let's go ahead and spray this plant again. You're going to see how easy it really does go. So of course I have my gas-powered backpack sprayer on here. I'm going to stand back. I'm going to plant my feet. I'm going to direct my spray, turn on my pressure, turn on my throttle. Simple, spray to wet. Again, it's translaminar, so if we don't get the underside of the leaf where that scale is actually present, it'll be absorbed in through the top of the leaf. As the insect begins to feed, they'll become in contact with that active ingredient. It'll interrupt their life cycle, and will have great efficacy, especially on our armored and soft scales.
As Patrick mentioned, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into T-scale, which is a very common scale insect down in the southern parts of the United States. And it's very common on camellia and hollies. It's going to have first generation crawlers at about 120 growing degree days, which is very early. And it has almost continuous crawler development from February through November. So this is a great target for peroxide, which is our insect growth regulator, to utilize throughout the year. And the crawlers are the most important susceptible life stage. It's where the nymph has legs and antenna present, and they're not protected by that waxy outer coating. And they're moving to find a new suitable site where they can feed. So this is the perfect time to get them. So notice the crawlers are yellow and the immature males are white. So make sure you're taking note of that. And then the immature females are that dark part of the T-scale. It is going to be a little bit challenging sometimes to see these without necessarily a hand lens. So I would definitely keep that in your toolbox or in your vehicle just for when you're doing these site inspections. And as Patrick mentioned, peroxide is a fantastic product. It's the active ingredient is pyroproxyfen, and it's highly effective against armored and soft scales. And it does also work on whiteflies and thrips, but I would say probably 95% of what you're going to probably be using this on is scale insects. And what makes this different than an insecticide is that it interrupts the scale's life cycle. So it doesn't instantaneously kill them, it prevents them from moving into the next life stage. And this is very helpful because it's very targeted to just scale insects and these kind of sucking insects. So it does have some benefits that it's not going to have an impact on many beneficial insects as well. The life stages that are affected are eggs, so it does work as an ovicidal. The nymphs, the adults, are sterilized. So it's perfect for some of those IPM programs that where, you know, maybe you've got a few other things going on in the property, or maybe there's pollinators that you're being sensitive to, which is a good practice. But what it's doing is it's mimicking a juvenile hormone, and it's going to disrupt their growth. So they aren't going to be able to move to that next life stage. So that population is going to crash. It is foliar applied, but it does not have a pollinator box. So once it is dry on the plant, it is very non-toxic for bees and pollinators. And it does have the added benefit of being translaminar. So it does move from the bottom side of the leaf to the bottom, and from the bottom to the top as well. Unlike as we talked about with the horticultural oil, where it's truly, if it doesn't touch that part, you're not going to have control. So it does give you a little bit of play and a little bit of forgiveness as you're doing those applications. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all join us. We'll answer some questions here. Again, my name is Chris. My partner is Patrick down there in North Carolina. And also we'll draw your attention to, as we kind of get some of these questions rolling in, that we do have some webinars still coming up. We have a couple on spotted lanternfly. There'll be another one similar to this about how to do the applications. We'll have another one for EAB as well, which will focus primarily on trunk injection. And then we have a couple of business builder ones where there are some panel discussions. And then certainly, as we answer questions here, thank you for attending. Please do take just a couple of minutes to fill out our survey that follows immediately after we end here when we start answering questions. So we'll send out the state pesticide applicator credits. Have your state pesticide license ready. Click the link provided in the chat below, and then fill out the form. And certainly we'll also include the scale management guide and also the link for the spring plant healthcare guide. So we'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Well, hey, everybody.
Hello.
We have some really great questions here. And Chris, I guess we just take it kind of from the top. One is a question about when you can apply horticultural oil. So it says here, leaf buds are starting to swell. How soon do the first instar crawlers start to appear in the phyto season? Well, I guess got ahead of myself with the question about horticultural oil. So your first instar crawlers are going to appear based upon the species of scale insects. So you're going to want to make sure that you properly identify what scale you're dealing with. Early on in the presentation, we were talking about either magnolia scale or tulip tree scale as being our target pest. And those crawlers don't usually come out until later on in the season. So you're looking at, what'd you say, Chris, up in Minnesota?
In Minnesota, you're looking at probably late July, maybe August. So Manitoba, heck, it could be maybe even into August when you see that first instar potentially.
Yeah. Versus other scales, which, they might come out earlier on in the season. So something like a Lacanium scale, you might see, down here in the Carolinas, we see those come out in like late May. So you want to make sure you identify the scale for sure. If you have any questions, you can feel free to send us some photographs. We'd be happy to help you out with that. Yeah. The next one we have here is another question about scale instars. And it asks, can instar changes take place in a matter of days or does it take longer? And are these changes dependent on temperature? And the answer is they can. Yes, and yes. It is dependent upon temperature. And so, a matter of days, anything can happen overnight, right? So usually, your instar is going to stay an instar for a matter of weeks, but they will, eventually, obviously, one day just decide to mold on you. So you want to, again, this is one of these things where you want to know what your species of scale is, and that'll help. And again, these are temperature dependent. We've referenced growing degree days a few times throughout the presentation. And that's a measure of heat accumulation throughout a year, and they can help you kind of predict when these different scale insects are going to molt, hatch, what have you. Excellent.
Here's another great one about, is it still safe to apply a dormant oil in the spring after the bud caps have fallen off? Yeah, you want to shed some light on that one?
Sure, yeah, so it is. So again, this is where you want to pay attention to temperature and rates. So early on in the spring, those as the leaves are coming out, of course, they can be very delicate. So that wouldn't preclude us from using horticultural oil, but we might want to drop our rate. So, a dormant rate or an early season rate might be 3 gallons per 100 gallons. We might want to start thinking about dropping that down to at least 2 gallons per 100 gallons. And then likewise, temperatures. So where we see phytotoxicity with horticultural oil is really because horticultural oil dries, it'll pull moisture from the leaves. So that's where if you have like really cold nights and the plant's kind of sucking in moisture, and then the horticultural oil as it dries, pulling out moisture, that's where you can see some of that phytotoxicity. Likewise, when it's really hot out, same thing. If you're in kind of drought-like conditions, the horticultural oil is pulling water as it's drying, and of course the plant itself is dry. So the answer is, yeah, you could use it as the bud caps are coming off. Just use some caution, but it should work really well. And a real quick note too, these modern horticultural oils like RTSA horticultural oil are really highly refined. So it's not like the stuff that, some of us were using back in the 70s. Of course, I was not using it in the 70s, but some of us in the 70s and 80s that were using some of these horticultural oils, there was a higher chance of phytotoxicity versus what we're using now, like the 98% pure hort oils. So good question. And then
as far as Q&A, it's not a typical practice, Luis, but certainly what we could maybe do is print it or create a PDF of the Q&A in the chat and then send it out, because addressing some of the fuzzy or blurry scale conversation, certainly what we'll do is we'll create a PDF of the slides, and then as a post after the webinar, we can send those out as requested to people as well.
And then we have another one here about pH and how that can affect different products. And most of the products we talked about here today are going to be pretty stable in pH. We can share, at the conclusion of this, we have a cheat sheet that talks about different products and their stability at different pHs. But in general, what we spoke about today is going to be pretty stable in most pHs. Likewise, though, it's things like you want to try to mix what you need for that day and not hold these products, overnight or over a 24-hour period, because there are other impurities in your water as well as just, the product itself, where they can just begin to degrade over some time in those, solutions. So something to keep in mind. It's not like you want to mix on Monday for, sprays you'll be doing through Friday. So
Yeah.
And
Pentrabark. Yeah, so there's a question on our Pentrabark and scrimmage. They would be the same. Active ingredients and the inerts are basically the same. It's just different trade names.
Yep, exactly. And then there's also, we bring up another good point about some additional PP with Proxite, and all the pyroproxyfen products around the market do have just some additional PPE requirements on them. So that's good to call out there. And then we have a question here about, do we have plans to sell a liquid version of Transtect? And Transtect Infusible is a liquid. So that's, though it's a fusible formulation labeled thus for. So.
Are the products affected by water pH for soft or hard water sources? Would you need a pH adjuster or a tank adjuvant? Depends on how far or what your pH is, I guess, how far off it is. Generally speaking, you want to have your spray mixtures at about neutral or as close to neutral as possible. pH more often than not will reduce the half-life of a lot of products, especially herbicides. Pesticides are less affected by that. I don't believe, Patrick, horticultural oil, the pH would make much of a difference in that.
No, I don't believe so.
And as far as hard water goes, I don't believe that having any additional iron or calcium in there is too much of a concern, at least in my experience.
No, and I'm just looking at our chart here to double check, and pH can be an issue with pyroproxyfen. It can cause rapid degradation, but again, we're talking about something that is over a long period of time. So if you're mixing for that day, there should be little issues with that. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions around scale or any particular scale insect issues that you guys are dealing with? Spruce bud scale, that's a fun one.
Do you have any tips on spruce bud scale? I have to admit that spruce bud scale is not an issue in the southeastern United States. So that's something I would have to
Sure.
dig into the data a little bit on.
Yeah. So historically, I think typically an application of Transtect in the spring is most effective on that. The hardest part about that is typically just getting close enough to the trunk tissue to actually do the application. And that's where I think a lot of times applications aren't as effective, is because people aren't able to get as close to the root flare as possible, so they end up actually having a reduced amount of pesticide that's going in there. But Guy, unfortunately, if you're in Canada, your options for management are quite limited. So you might be just limited to really horticultural oil, but I certainly am not an expert to speak on Canadian approved products.
Indeed, yeah. I just Googled it though. It's a pretty looking crawler.
Orlando says he's got, Orlando Tree Consulting, pardon me, says he has an active tulip tree scale on magnolias in Orlando, already past crawler stage. What method and product would you suggest using?
Oh, that's a great question. So, one is the Transtect would work very well on that. Now, there's some things to consider when you're using your systemics. One is going to make sure that you have adequate soil moisture and the tree is relatively healthy already. So that would be an option for you for in the interim. And then once whoever survives, when they go through their next generation of laying eggs and then hatching, then timing that up with a peroxide application that's that insect growth regulator, keep them just breaking that life cycle, keeping them from maturing. And if you can get them on their crawlers before they molt into that kind of second stationary instar, you shouldn't see any of the honeydew associated with it. So for those, specifically magnolia scale or tulip tree scale, they can be kind of tough to manage just because of, when they hatch and where they feed. Most of the time, they don't make their way out to leaves. Now, again, going back to you in Florida, if you're dealing with southern magnolias, there's a good chance they'll move out onto the leaves. And when they move out onto the leaves, they're so much easier to kill with our, things like Transtect, Donateffuran. So maybe that one application, Donateffuran, will work really well for you. Again, if they're on southern magnolia there in Florida, which that's my bet is what they're on. Could be wrong. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we're at 6 minutes past the hour, which is a little over time. We appreciate everybody that attended today. See, we have some people dropping off. Let us know if you have any other questions. We're always free to help, and look forward to seeing you out and about sometimes. Have a great one, y'all.
Absolutely. Thanks all. Have a great one. Thanks for attending.